Hello, students. Uh, in our previous session, we had started the lesson. I believe that books will never disappear. And just to have a recap of the scene, we started with Robert Alifano asking George Louis Borges about the first book that he read, his literary experience, and he begins with Grimm's fairy tales. And then we moved on to the eulogy or the praise that George Louis had for his mother. What he speaks about his mother, that she was an extraordinary woman, a kind-hearted person, and he was, feeling a kind of guilt for having not given that due respect to his mother when she was alive. And indirectly, he was telling all of us to respect our parents, especially when they are alive, by giving them their due respect. Then we moved on to another important aspect, another question that Robert Alifano asked George Louis Borges about his blindness. We can say either about his blindness or misfortunes in life. And he says, well, all the misfortunes, embarrassments, and difficulties in life have been proved like a blessing for him. He says they are a kind of resources, and he is not bothered about the blindness. In fact, he says he never considers he is blind, hence, he goes on piling up his personal library with books, though he is unable to read, but he thinks he is not blind. You see, the positive way of accepting the misfortunes in life. Okay, he spoke and gave a reference to Greek epic, that is Homer's epic Iliad and Odyssey, how the king Odysseus, giving reference to that particular aspect. And then the next question was posed to him about the books. And he speaks about the Library of Alexandria, which was burning, the dream that he had. And next, Robert Alifano asked him about writing a book on the history of books and giving a reference to Spengler, to the particular book that is Decline of the West. He, in fact, George Louis Borges declines to write a book, but he says it's a good project, but giving his present age and his status, he says it may not be a feasible thing, a wise thing to do. Okay, now today let's continue and the rest of the lesson and understand. Okay, we have understood about his blindness and other things. Now let's go the next question, what Alifano is posing to George Louis Borges. Okay, in one of your essays you quote the words of Bernard Shaw. Bernard Shaw, you must remember, is a very good writer, and especially he is known for his satires and other things. Every book worth being reread has been written by the Spirit. Every book being worth being reread has been written by the Spirit. What do you say about this? And Borges gives a beautiful reply. It's a little difficult to understand, but pay attention to this explanation. Borges says, yes, I completely concur with the notion. I completely agree with the notion. Since a book goes beyond its author's intention. You must remember, when any author writes a book, he writes with a particular intention. But when the reader reads it, he gets something more than that. In fact, he has to get it because the writer writes keeping in mind his own cultural milieu. He writes keeping in mind his own background and the study that he has done. Now, when the reader reads it, he must be from a different cultural background. He must be from a different geographical background. So he reads it with different understandings. So it has to go beyond author's intention. Then only the purpose is achieved. Otherwise, the writer's purpose is not achieved. That is the reason there are certain books, you can read them at any time. Though they are written in, previous century, they are more relevant even today. We feel as if, the book is very relevant for us today. For example, there will be a story in our textbook that is the water. That is, the cultural background is that of South Africa, but is so relevant for all of us. Let's go back to that first year, the first lesson that we studied, The Gentleman of the Jungle. Though, again from Kenyan background, South African background, how relevant even it is for us today. You see? So every story or every book goes beyond the intention of the author. The author's intention is a meager thing, a fallible thing. He says, when an author writes, he may not be thinking all these things. It's a very meager thing, fallible. There can be errors as well. But when the reader reads it, you see, he reads it in a different way. He gets many things from that particular book. In a book, in every book, there is a need for something more, which is always mysterious. George Borges says, every book contains something very mysterious, something very strange. And the reader gets it when he reads it. Let's take the example of our religious books. It can be the Holy Quran, it can be the sacred Bible, it can be the Bhagavad Gita. See, all these books, remember or just imagine when they were written, centuries back. But see, we read them today, and every time we read, it gives us a new meaning. If I'm very happy, I read this Bible, I feel very happy. It gives a nice meaning for me. When I'm very sad, I get a relevant passage from the Bible and it makes me or fills me with hope. It strengthens me, it gives me courage. You see, the book goes beyond author's intention. I'm telling you about the sacred scripture because it's easy to understand. You take any other book for that matter. Any book for that matter, it always fills us and gives us new hope. We have seen people changing their life by reading a book, a very simple, ordinary book that has changed the life of many people. That's what George Borges says here. For the author, when he writes, it's a meager thing, it's a simple thing, it's a trivial thing, it is a fallible thing. But for the reader, there can be something more. When we read an ancient book, it is as though we were reading all time that has passed from the day it was written to our present day. Just now I told you about this sacred scriptures, ancient book, but how relevant it is today. There are many books for that matter. Sometimes they are biographies of people or autobiographies of people. They just give us a new perspective to the life. We must remember this. That's why books are more meaningful. Books are more meaningful. A book can be full of errors. We can reject its author's opinions, disagree with him or her, but the book always retains something sacred, something mortal, something magical which brings happiness. Very beautifully said. You see, the author is not perfect when he writes, though he has to do a lot of work. He simply can't scribble something. There can be errors in his understanding. We may not agree with the ideas that the author has presented in a particular book, but he says the book always is sacred, something mortal, something magical, which brings happiness. They say for physical exercise, we go for games and sports or kind of exercise, yoga or something like that. But what about for mental exercise? We call it as mental delectation. And for this, we need to read books because they give us a kind of exercise. So for you, all of you, please remember, mobile or your internet, social media is not perfect mental delectation, mental entertainment. It would take you away from the right path. The best thing is to read the books, because books open us to different realities. When we read the books, pick up any book and begin to read. And I'll tell you, your perspective changes, your thinking changes, your attitude changes. And that's what George Borges says here. Every book worth being reread is written by the Spirit. Why he says? Because you see, you read the book, there are many movies sometimes, we see 100 times. Okay, though we know what is going to happen next, but still we see it because we like the movie. Similarly, the book, you read the book, you have read it already, but you read many times because that book is written by the Spirit. Spirit doesn't mean demon. Spirit doesn't mean devil here. It refers to, the inner aspect of a person, the spiritual aspect. So he says it is not just written by ordinary purpose. It is really written by the Spirit, where a connection takes place between the writer and the reader. Whether the writer is dead or alive, still the connection takes place, and the Spirit goes on revealing us so many things, and we understand the book becomes very relevant for all of us. Such books we should read. Such books we should read. And really, I had read one book, I'll tell you. The tough times don't last, but tough people do. I repeat, the tough times don't last, but tough people do. It gave me a new understanding about my life. I would always getting upset whenever there are difficulties in life. But the book told me there are many stories, there are many incidents which narrate this. The point is proved that the tough times, they come and go. They are not there forever. But those who face these tough times, they become very tough. And later they can face any situation. So every time a new challenge is come, the person refers to the old one and says, I have, withstood the old ones, I can withstand this. Tough times don't last, tough times come and go, but tough people, those who face, they always remain, and they face and they face and they become successful in life. Such books we should read. Okay, I read another book, that is The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari, I think it is by Chetan Bhagat. The monk who sold his Ferrari. See the relationship, where is monk and where is a Ferrari? Ferrari is a modern vehicle, and the monk supposed to be away from the society, away from something called modernism. But monk who sold his Ferrari for the sake of some kind of particular knowledge is ready to do anything, because you see, for the sake of wisdom, what he does. Beautiful book once again. So another book I read was something called, How to Teach an Elephant to Dance. See the title, how funny it is. How to teach an elephant to dance. Elephant cannot dance, very heavy animal it is, but how to teach? Meaning to say, like, there is nothing that we cannot learn. Everything is possible in our life. If those of you think PUC is very difficult, English is very difficult, accountancy, physics, chemistry is very difficult, understanding if an elephant can be taught how to dance, and if an elephant can pick up the dance, then you too can be taught, and you too can pick up anything in your life. Only the will is required. Let us go ahead and see what the next idea he speaks about. Right. Borges, what is poetry? How would you define it? What is poetry? How would you define it? I want all of you to go through these slides which I have presented here. They have got very beautiful meaning in that. Okay. See, this in itself is a question here. What is that? What is poetry? Or the concept of poetry as explained by George Louis Borges. What does he say? I believe that poetry is so intimate, so essential, that it cannot be defined without oversimplifying it. Poetry cannot be defined without oversimplifying it. In other words, if you go to define poetry, in fact, you are making it less important. You are making it, oversimplifying. It is not good. It loses its taste. Something like, you go on adding water to the milk. The milk becomes watery. No more the qualities or characteristics of milk remains there. We don't even want to drink it. It has no protein. It has no vitamins. We throw it. Similarly, he says that if you go to define poetry, if you go to explain poetry, there is a danger of the poetry losing its originality. Why? If you go back to the lesson, the gardener, there also, P. Lankesh says, while defining that particular story, in the beginning itself says, there is a danger of me, oversimplifying it again. Same concept is used. In other words, certain things cannot be explained more. You need to understand. You need to understand, or through experience, you need to understand it. That's why he says poetry cannot be explained, oversimplified. It would be like attempting to define the color yellow or love and the fall of leaves in autumn. You take this example. How can you explain to me the color yellow? You can just tell me, well, it looks yellow. More than that, can you explain to me? No. Next, let us take example, love. Love. I think I told you this meaning. What is love? I had told you once, love is an irresistible desire of a person to be desired irresistibly by the other person. Love is an irresistible desire of a person to be desired by the other person irresistibly. This can be love between father and children, or parents and children. It can be between brothers. It can be between a boy and a girl. It can be anybody. It is an irresistible desire. Now see, I can't go on more than this, because all these things need to be experienced in life and you understand them. So he says, similarly, like love, or like color yellow, or like falling of the leaves in this autumn. Leaves fall, and in the season of autumn, the leaves dry and they fall down. That experience should be seen and experienced, not explained. Not explained. By explaining, if you go to explain, it loses its meaning. Similarly, poetry, he says. I believe that poetry is the aesthetic act. Very, very important. The second point I have put here. Poetry is an aesthetic act. Look at the slide here. Poetry is a story that is so good, it doesn't need complete sentences. I need to tell you the difference between the prose and the poetry. In simple words, we can say prose refers to something that is written in paragraphs. Excuse me. Prose refers to something that we write in paragraphs, and poetry that we write in verse. Okay. So poetry is a story that is so good it doesn't need complete sentences. That's why in poetry we give importance to rhymes. Forget about meter and other things. It is not required for the time being. So George Louis Borges says poetry is the aesthetic act. What do you mean by aesthetic? Aesthetic means the sense of beauty. Sense of beauty one has. For example, if you are a very aesthetic person, you will be always well dressed. Need not be new dressed, but cleanly dressed. You present yourself very good. Your books will be clean, your handwriting will be clean, and your house will be clean, because that beauty is given more importance. Order is given more importance. So poetry is a sense or an act of beauty, he says. It is an aesthetic act. That poetry is not the poem. For the poem may be nothing more than a series of symbols. You just take any poem, for example, 4 lines poem, or 2 lines poem, or 8 lines poem, or a sonnet, 12 or 14 lines. He says they are nothing but series of symbols, syllables. They are words. That's what. Okay. If you take prose, again we say it's a paragraph, it's a group of some meaningful words on a particular idea. Fine. But poetry says is a series of symbols. But poetry is not that. He says poetry, I believe, is the poetic act that takes place when the poet writes it, when the reader reads it, and it always happens in a slightly different manner. Take the third point here. Poetry is the poetic act that takes place when the poet writes it, when the reader reads it, and there is always a difference. I need to explain this to you. Something similar to about the book that was written by the Spirit. Now we see, when a poet writes a poem, it's very difficult to understand a poem, because a particular poem I would explain in a different way, another person would explain in a different way, third person would explain it in a different way, because each one understands it in a different way. But the prose, that possibility is not there. Everybody would explain a prose with the same meaning, on the meaning that is on the peripheral level. But the poetry has got a deeper meaning. That is why Borges calls this as poetic act. Now it's very important for you to understand what is poetic act. And Borges says poetic act is when the poet writes a poem, and when the reader reads a poem, there is always a difference. There is always a different meaning to it. I'll give you one example. Arun Koladkar, I think Arun Koladkar is a Indian poet from Maharashtra. He writes a poem. No, sorry, it is not Arun Koladkar, it is Jiv Patel. Jiv Patel writes a poem. What is the title of the poem? How to Kill a Tree. Strange, isn't it? See, the title of the poem is How to Kill a Tree. And he says, take a knife, go and cut, and the tree is fallen. But he says, the simple jab of the knife doesn't kill a tree. For example, in the rainy season, you go and cut a tree. Don't cut it. I'm giving you an example. Cut the tree. What happens? Okay, you have cut the tree, but still the trunk remains. Okay, or the root remains. After 1 month, you would see again there are branches, buds coming up, small branches coming up, and again the tree grows like a previous tree. The original one is gone, but the new tree, in the sense, the tree is not gone. So he explains this way, you cannot kill a tree by that way. So how to kill a tree? He goes further and he says, you need to dig around the tree. Dig around the tree and expose the wide roots of the tree to the hot sun. When you go and expose the white roots of the tree to the hot sun, the roots dry. With that, the tree is destroyed completely, he says. In other words, if you have not destroyed the roots, the tree again would go back or grow back to its original stature. Now the question is this: why has he written this particular poem? Today we give so much importance for afforestation, and why is he speaking about deforestation? And especially, how can he teach the students how to cut a tree? He should have taught the students how to grow a tree. But do you know the poetic act here? Do you know what is the purpose or what each one understands? Well, I will tell you how I understood this particular poem. What does he mean by that cutting a tree or killing a tree? Here, tree refers to the bad habits that we have in our life, the vices that we have in our life. Suppose, imagine I have developed a smoking habit, and the smoking habit has become so much that I cannot remain without smoking. Now, how can I kill this tree of smoking? Simply that I stop. Okay, today I decide I don't smoke today, or I don't buy cigarettes today. With that, have I stopped? No. Tomorrow when I see a cigarette, tomorrow when I find someone smoking, I would go and ask him or borrow, and I don't hesitate. I borrow and I smoke. See what he's telling? Exactly the same. Simple jab of the night would not destroy or kill a tree. It would come back again. Even if I may say, okay, I won't smoke, and to lock down, no shops are open, so I won't get any cigarette. Fine. But the moment the lockdown is open, I think I would first run to that particular shop and buy the cigarette, and I would smoke. I would smoke. For example, nowadays, in every religion there is a period of time where they go on fasting. I think Hindus have begun, it's a holy month of Shravan where some of them don't eat meat and fish. But I'm sure soon after the month concludes, they would eat. Christians during the time of Lent, Catholics, Lent, they don't eat meat. It's a time for fasting and other things. They would do that. But soon after that, when the feast of Easter comes, they would begin to eat. Muslims fast for 1 month during Ramzan period. I do not know about their food habits, but still they have got certain practices. But all those restrictions are freed soon after that month gets over. Similarly, the bad habit doesn't go with the jab of night. Just by stopping it doesn't go. We need to root out the evil habits, the roots which are quite inside. What is the reason I smoke? What is the reason I drink? What is the reason I do like this? I need to find out, and I need to pluck those reasons. I need to pluck those roots. Then the bad habit, the vice is gone. Remember this, all of your practice. How to kill a tree of bad vices from your life. Just stopping doesn't help, but you need to root out the evil, the roots which have gone deep inside. See the meaning, see the poetic act that has taken place, isn't it? I'll give you another very simple and silly example. These two lines, they may not be perfect in Hindi language, but I remember them and I would tell you. There's a story something like this. What is the story? In olden days there was a king, and in olden days kings, in their courts there used to be many poets, writers, and they would write poetry and present it to the king. Sometimes they would write in praise of the king, For example, while studying about that poem, The Gardener, there we had studied about Thammanna and Basavaya, where Basavaya had become a great Thammanna had become a great poet, and people used to praise him. But Basavaya, there was nobody to praise him, so he used to appoint some people just to praise him. Similarly, in olden days, the kings used to have certain court poets in their courts. Their only job was to write in praise of the king. In Kannada, they used to call them Hogalubattas. They used to just praise the king. So, in a particular king's court, there was a poet who would always write poetry and present it to the king. And king would become so happy by his poetry, he used to reward with him gold coins, silver, and many other valuable things. Now, there was a poet in the neighboring house. He too was a poet, but he was not presenting anything to the king. So, one day, the wife of this particular poet, who was a poet but was not writing anything, coaxed this particular husband of her and said, Look at the other poet who is in the king's court. He writes so many poems and presents them to the king, and king rewards him with gold and silver and many other things. See, we have nothing to eat here. Why don't you write some poetry and present it to the king? Now, when the wife tells, the husband is compelled to write. Otherwise, there is a possibility that he may not get anything to eat that day. So, he takes a pen and a paper and sits by the window of his house to write poem, because you need to get inspiration to write a poetry. So, he sits by the window. It was raining and there was a small water tank in his garden. As he was watching, suddenly a crow came. Okay, you must have seen this image also. A crow comes there and began to dip his beak in the water and began to sharpen it. You must have seen. Many of the birds do that. They dip the beak in the water, and they begin to sharpen it. It's a kind of cleaning, I think they do. And the crow was doing that. Now that was an inspiration for this poet to write a poetry. And he took the pen and began to write in Hindi. It may not be grammatically right, but you will get the meaning. The poet wrote, "बार बार क्या गीस रहे हो लगा के पानी, बार बार क्या गीस रहे हो लगा के पानी, तेरे मन की बात बिना बताए मैंने जानी." I repeat, बार बार क्या गीस रहे हो लगा के पानी, तेरे मन की बात बिना बताए मैंने जानी. I hope you understood the meaning. What did the poet mean? He saw that the crow was cleaning his beak by dipping it in the water. So he said, many times you are doing that, sharpening your beak, and I can understand what you do that. You need not tell me, but I know your purpose of cleaning your beak. Only 2 lines. What happened then? Somebody came and the crow flew off. It ran off from there. Further, this poet did not get any inspiration to write. Now only 2 lines poem. He came and sat, and for the force of his wife, took those 2 lines and went to the king. Went to the king and told him, "I have written a poem of 2 lines and this is for you." The king took it, accepted it, and kept it by the side somewhere there. The next day morning, he forgot about that. Next day morning, the king's barber came to give him a shave, maybe a haircut also. King's barber came. Now, there was something interesting. When the king's barber came and the king sat there for his everyday shave or for his haircut, now the barber began to take the knife and began to sharpen it. Today we have got blades, okay, blade, razor. But olden days there was no blade. They used to use some kind of knife. With that, today also they use it. With that they used to shave. So the barber began to sharpen the knife. And when they sharpen, if you have seen, usually they dip it in the water and they sharpen it. It becomes more clear, this one, sharp. So he was doing that. And that day, the barber was taking additional time than the usual. He used to take extra time than the usual to sharpen. So the king thought, why is he taking extra time? And he thought, let me read the poem which was presented to me yesterday, the 2 lines which were there. So he says, since he is taking time, I would read the poem. So he brought the sheet of the paper on which these 2 lines were written and he began to read loudly. What was that? बार बार क्या गीस रहे हो लगा के पानी, तेरे मन की बात बिना बताए मैंने जानी. And he went on reading these 2 lines because there was time. Now the barber who was sharpening the knife heard this and he began to tremble. He began to shudder, he began to shiver. Because that day he was sent there by the enemy of the king. And what did the enemy tell him? When you go to give him a shave, sharpen your knife little more and kill him. So with that intention he was sharpening it more. Now when the king read the poem, he began to shudder, he began to shiver, because he thought that the king has come to know his purpose. बार बार क्या गीस रहे हो लगा के पानी, तेरे मन की बात मैंने बिना बताए मैंने जानी. And he fell at the feet of the king and said, I am very sorry, I did like this. Now can you imagine? The king called this particular poet and presented him with as many possible gold coins and silver and whatever he wanted, because those 2 lines saved his life. Now, did you understand the poetic act here? When the poet wrote, he wrote it with an intention. What was his intention? Maybe to satisfy his wife. Okay, maybe he just saw that something is scribbled. But when the reader reads it, there is some difference. And George Borges says it. What does he say? He says the poetic act takes place when the poet writes it, when the reader reads it. And it is always happens in a slightly different manner. The poet never thought with this he is going to save the life of the king. He never thought. But the reader understood different way. Similarly, Jiv Patel, maybe he must have told about writing, cutting a tree, but I understood in a different way. See the poetic act that has taken place here. When the poetic act takes place, it seems to me that we have become aware of it. Poetry is magical, mysterious, and unexplainable. That's why poem has got different meaning. Okay? Every time you hear, it is different in Kannada or in Hindi. This kavita vachan, you can understand how beautiful it is, how beautiful it gives different meanings. Sadly, we don't have it in English, but really it's so beautiful in any other regional language, especially in Indian languages. Okay, so it is magical, it is mysterious, and it is unexplainable. Then he says, although not incomprehensibly wet. Well, not that it cannot comprehend it. Don't think like that. But little difficult. It is magical. You need to enjoy a poetry. Should not find any mistakes there. Should always enjoy. Sometimes there are grammatical errors. Sometimes for the sake of rhymes, poet can do anything. It is allowed because the purpose of the poetry is something magical, something mysterious. If one doesn't feel the poetic event upon reading it, the poet has failed. See, very, very important. That's why everybody cannot be a poet. After reading a particular poem, if you don't feel that poetic act, then the poet has failed. Poet has failed. Okay, there is no meaning in that. You take any of the rhymes that we understand today, how meaningful they are, how beautiful they are, because two lines explain big volumes, just two lines, which is not possible in the prose. In the prose, we need to write everything. And especially in a prose, all the feelings have to be written, otherwise you don't understand. But in poetry, it is enough. Few words and volumes could be spoken on those two lines or two words. Why? The poetic act takes place there. I hope you understood something from this. Right. Next. Borges, what is important in the art of poetry is finding the precise words. Further, he speaks about Alifano Asim. When we write poetry, what about using the precise words in poetry? What do we mean by precise words? You simply can't write a poem. You just said to write a poem. Sometimes you will not get proper words to express your feelings. Proper words cannot be there. They are not there. And a poet, that is the greatness of a poet. I would specially tell you, other than your textbook poems, think about the film, lyrics, the poems, how properly they explain the words. One example is given here. Since we have not studied that poem, we may not understand. But I will give you some other examples from different poems. To a great extent, those precise words are what elicit the emotion. Borges says a poet has to use right word in the right place. Otherwise, emotions are not brought out. Because if you use a similar meaning word, same emotions may not come out. One example is given here. I always remember that wonderful line in a poem by Emily Dickinson which can exemplify this. Now, George Borges says, what about using precise words? Precise means exact words in the exact place. He gives an example of the poet. One poetess, she is a lady poet by name Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson. I don't know whether you have studied one poem, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, that was written by her. She always wrote on death aspect, something like that, because her personal life was a lot of tragedies there. That's not important for us. Now, he is quoting one particular line from this Emily Dickinson's poem. He says, well, Emily Dickinson uses these words, this quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies. It's actually a metaphor that is used there. This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies. The idea is banal. The idea is simple. The idea of dust, the dust of death, will all be dust one day, is a cliche. But what surprises is the phrase gentlemen and ladies, which gives the magic and poetic quality. If she had written men and women, it would have failed as poetry. It would have been trivial. But finding the precise words, she wrote, "This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies." Now, what is this? She writes a poem. What is that poem? That poem, the topic of the poem was death. Now, she is in a particular place called the burial ground, cemetery, okay, cremation ground, burial ground. And there she has buried someone, maybe her close one, and she goes to that tomb and finds that mud, finds that soil, the dust. And now she writes a poem, now which means her beloved or somebody whom she loved must have been there, has become one with the mud, one with the dust, because they are buried there. When you are buried, of course, you become one with the dust. In Bible, there's a beautiful saying, from dust you have come and to the dust you will go back to return, you will return. So now it has become dust. Now she is writing a poem addressing this dust, but she doesn't call that dust as dust. What does she call? This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies. Why? Because some people are buried there, they have become dust. So she calls that dust as gentlemen and ladies. Now Borges says, in the place of gentlemen and ladies, let us put the words, let us change the words as men and women. How it will be? See, this quiet dust was men and women. Now you know the effect will not be so good. It doesn't create so many emotions. But when you use the word gentlemen and ladies, perfect. Okay, which means she is respecting the people who are buried there as gentlemen and ladies. When we address someone in the public, we don't say men and women, we say gentlemen and ladies. That is the respect. Similarly here, this quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies, meaning to say some respectable people are buried here. Once upon a time you were human beings, now you have become dust. But still I don't call it as a dust, I call it as gentlemen and ladies. Beautiful, isn't it? Now think of some of the poems and try to change particular word with a similar one. You can take the famous poet I always quote is Jayant Kaikini from Gokarna, from our own place. Mungaru Male film lyrics he has written. Okay, just try to change the words. Anisutide yake yako yendu ನೀನೇನು ನನ್ನ ಒಳ್ಳೆಯದು, very simple line, right? ಅನಿಸುತ್ತದೆ, try to change that into something else. ಅನಿಸುತ್ತದೆ, ಭಾಸವಾಗುತ್ತಿದೆ, feeling. No, it doesn't. That word has to be that. You can't change it. Maybe when we try to change the words of a poet, how it will become. I'll give you an example. God has created us beautifully. On the top we have got head, okay, then we have got our eyes, then we have got our nose, then we have got our mouth, then we have got the whole body. Now can you think God has done something wrong by fixing the ear in this place? This ear shouldn't be here, it should be down here, somewhere down below. How it would be? I'm sure during Corona times, if ears were not here, we would not have been able to fix our mask. What I mean to say is, God has created us so perfectly, you cannot change. I can't say, my one eye, it should not be here, it should be behind here. No, it is perfect. Similarly, in a poem, when a poet perfectly writes, he has to use precise words he has to use. That's why he is called a poet. All of us are not Jayant Kaikinis. All of us are not William Wordsworth. All of us are not to T.S. Eliot. All of us are not to John W. No, kids, we are not. Because we don't have that gift. We cannot do poetic justice. We cannot have this poetic act when we write something. Okay, we can't even write one paragraph properly, one line properly. So that is a sad thing of it, and that's what George Borges said. That's why today we study George Borges, because he is a great man. Okay, let's continue. You have said that metaphors exist. Okay, next we go to very beautiful idea. You have said that metaphors exist from our very beginnings. Could you expound on that concept, Borges? Okay, now he speaks about metaphors. Now this is a little very important aspect of this lesson, metaphors. I think I need to explain a little more on this. So we will study this in the next part of this lesson. For the timing, this part should be enough, and I would like to stop here. So little difficult to understand. Pay attention, play the lesson many times, and you will be able to understand it.